I don't need the microphone, but I'll use it anyways.
Very excited to be here tonight. I see many familiar faces. I've missed you all. Although I am in the building every single day, but normally at a different, I think, time frame than most of you. I'm so excited to be here with Ben, who I actually met online sometime during COVID when you wrote your first book. And I'm very, very honored to be here as the moderator. That's what it's called, Marty. It's called a moderator.
Still correcting me.
Still to this day. And so tonight we have the amazing opportunity to kind of dive in with Ben about Jewish indigenuity, what that means, what it looks like, and a little bit of, you'll share a little bit of your other books and what you wrote and the ideas that you discuss. And I want to start by kind of before I pose the question to you, because you start the book, first page is a story about a pomegranate. And I want to turn to you. Raise of hands. Who here has a pomegranate on their Rosh Hashanah table? And now I know it's New England, so sometimes it's not a real pomegranate, but yes, just with the raise of hands, who has or ever had a pomegranate on their Rosh Hashanah dinner? Okay. So Ben, now I'll turn it back to you because I think I kind of made the point. Why is that the story that you chose to open the book, which is kind of like a hook, right? I mean, the second I read it, I was like, oh yeah, I'm in.
So first of all, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be sitting with you and to see you again. Well, I think that's it. I think because I always understood, so I'm from Scotland, as you may be able to tell by my dulcet tones, and the pomegranate is not indigenous to Scotland. That is the raspberry. And actually, I'm going to say the Scottish raspberries are like the best in the world. So if you get a chance to try them, please do. But we always had pomegranate. And it was a symbol of the difference between us as Jews and the non-Jews whose society in which we lived. And I think that was such a clear notion to me growing up, is that we were a minority. But there was no value attributed to that. It wasn't good or bad, it just was, because my maths is really appalling, but even I can tell that 5,000 Jews is less than 5 million Scottish people, right? So we were a literal minority. And I understood through the way we lived our lives. So the fact that we spoke Hebrew, the fact that we did Shabbat, the fact that we ate pomegranate, it was always so clear to me. And not just that we were a minority, right? It was that we were a minority and that Israel was our home. Everything in my house was really focused on Israel. And my brother made Aliyah, served in the IDF for a decade. My sister made Aliyah laterally. Both are married to Israelis with Israeli kids. So Israel was always the center point. And I really understood that from pomegranate. And I also remember it being a thing. I think probably like a lot of men, my dad got off pretty light with the work involved in hosting a Rosh Hashanah meal. It was like a military operation, and as a kid I never understood this, and now when I host, I turned into my mother, and it's also a military operation. But the instruction was always, don't forget the pomegranate. And it was something that he had to remember, and it was something that which took pride and place in the center of our table. And we also ate pomegranate seeds, and that continued. I used to live in Hong Kong. That's when we first met online. And I remember sending my partner out to get a pomegranate when we hosted Rosh Hashanah. So it continued, because again, in Hong Kong, the pomegranate's not native. But it was such a symbol to me of the difference between us and the people whose society in which we lived. And again, the fact that it was always rooted in Israel.
It's funny because I think it's the same with me. I've in the past, I think 2 years, have hosted Rosh Hashanah, and I don't send my husband because he would come without one, but I always look for a pomegranate, and I always remember like a day or two before, and I'm like, where am I going to find a pomegranate? And I don't want to go all into the city to find, the only Jewish store to find one. Usually, Whole Foods, they are saving grace. Usually, they'll have a pomegranate even if it's early in the season. But yeah, I feel the same, and I think that it really kind of is a aha moment, because in Israel we had them on our trees. I never had to stop to think about how difficult it is to find one. So let's dive a little bit into this book. Your first two books talk a lot about Jewish pride. And this has has that in there, but it's a little bit different. And I'm curious why you decided to jump into the concept of kind of Jewish indigenuity and how it's different or connected to your other two books.
I think I was probably a little naive. I was like, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write this book. And I never really considered the fact that this book is really left field from my other work. The Jewish Pride trilogy, so me and the Star Wars guy, he's a trilogy, and also Lord of the Rings, Tolkien. So the Jewish Pride trilogy was really based on my experience with gay pride. So I learned what it meant to go on a journey of self-acceptance as a young person. And I took the ideas and the framework and applied that to the Jewish community. So that was book number one. Book number two was an investigation into internalized anti-Jewishness. Or internalized anti-Semitism, you could say. So that again was based on my experience with internalized homophobia. But this is, apart from that prologue where I do discuss my experience, the rest of the book is not really about me, it's this study. And I didn't give it an enormous amount of thought in terms of how it was going to be different. I just knew that I needed to write about this because it was a conversation I was seeing percolating. People are having this conversation already, but we needed the kind of academic framework to pin it on, right? We need to say, okay, this is why we're Indigenous and we can prove it. And we can prove it. It's not actually a very difficult thing to prove. And then also, if I reflected on my work on Jewish pride, in the first book and the second book, I say a couple of things. The first thing I said was, Jews have to reject non-Jewish definitions of Jewish identity. So therefore, the only people who get to define Jewish identity are the Jews. And that doesn't mean our allies can't give their perspectives, but they should still be kind of towing the party line, as it were. And I realised, though, it's not enough just to do that. It's not enough just to reject the non-Jewish definitions of who we are. We need to define our own identities. But how can we do that if we don't know who we are? And my personal perspective is that there is a dearth of knowledge in the Jewish world. That this is the first ever book on this subject. Like, that's a bit mad. Like, why was it a Scottish Jew that had to write this book? It should have been written by an Israeli or an American or a Canadian, but it wasn't. This is not a topic that we've explored, and it's one which that does us a disservice. And I'm ultimately a teacher. That's what I was. I was lecturing and I was teaching in Hong Kong, and I always said that I wanted my work to educate, inspire, and empower. The first book was Inspire, the second book was Empower, so the third book was obviously, to me, naturally going to be educating. And I just thought, I feel that we're Indigenous. And when you write a book, you get to be a little selfish and you get to say, I think this is really interesting, I'm going to spend 2 years exploring it. And hopefully other people will also find it interesting to justify it to my publisher and my partner and everyone in my life. But I wanted to explore this. I wanted to understand and prove that we were Indigenous because I'm really tired of the debate surrounding Jewish identity, particularly when it comes from the non-Jewish world, but even in the Jewish world. I was saying just previously, we have to agree on certain things. The Talmudic tradition of debate and dialogue is wonderful, but it shouldn't lead us away from agreeing to the basics and having boundaried conversations, one of which being Israel is the Indigenous land of the Jews. And it's not just that it's our Indigenous land, then we have rights. Then we have a right to sovereignty in Israel. So that's very important as well.
So you touched a little bit about internal anti-Semitism, and we're going to come back to that, both internal and external. But to me, as an Israeli, someone who grew up in Israel, it's almost obvious to me that we are a people, that we are Indigenous, that we have a connection, whether it's based on learning Torah in school and kind of those stories becoming reality, being able to see history in your own eyes. And, we learn as Jews, we are a people. Way before we were a religion, we were a people. Even in the Torah, we're a people first, Am Yisrael. And it's almost completely obvious. And again, I think some of the reasons is because there are so many Israelis who identify themselves as secular. It's not quite the secular Americans, but that maybe is a reason they have to tie themselves into this notion. But it's not the same with the Jews in the diaspora, and I wonder why you think that is.
I totally agree with you, and I think that in the diaspora, Judaism has been framed as a religion, and I think this has been enormously harmful. And obviously, Judaism contains religion, right? We have God. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. That is a statement of a belief in God. So we have God, so there is religion. It's quite different though to being a people with religion to simply being a religion. We're not a religion, we have never been a religion. There's no word for religion in the Torah. We describe ourselves as Am, and even the modern word for a religious person in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, is Dati. Dati comes from Dat, which originated or was first used in reference to law. So the question is, when did it go from law to religion? And ultimately what we see is it happened because of the Christian world. Following the Reformation, Christians started to refer to all systems of belief as religio, religions. And then Jews caught on to that, and Jews wanted to be accepted, they wanted to be understood, and they wanted to fit into a framework. Because as I kind of refer, and this line is always taken out of anything I write by my editors, but I always refer to our Christian overlords. And that's what they were overlords. We had to fit into their society. We were really a minority with very few rights. And as we edged towards the Enlightenment, we wanted to remake ourselves in their eyes. And I think it has been enormously harmful because it has given us this cognitive dissonance. Because in the diaspora, we talk about Am Yisrael, we say Am Yisrael Chai, we talk about being atheist or secular, which I agree, I think that's a word. If there's enough time, we'll get to why I think secular is not a word that we as Jews should use, even though that is traditionally how I would have identified. We acknowledge this on one hand, but we say that we're a religion on another, and it's cognitive dissonance. And the clearest way I have to describe it is, in Judaism and the Jews are Levantine. We come from the Middle East. It is not European. And the Middle East, the Levant, is our context. And in the societies which came from that land, or that region, you never had this separation of church and state as you laterally did in Europe. God is present in all we do. And I will say this as a Jew who doesn't really concern himself with God, but I say Kaddish for my late father, and if you read the translation of Kaddish, it's literally all about God. I say Kiddush, I light candles with my partner. Again, we're making a blessing. So I, as a Jew who doesn't really concern himself with God, I'm still interacting with God because I'm interacting with Jewishness, which is very different to Christianity. And there was like an aha moment, you meant like that phrase. And I was watching a scary film with my partner, I love horror. And there's a woman from Glee, remember the show Glee, Diana Agron, who is Jewish, and she has done kind of like some Jewish themed movies, which is kind of fun. So it was a Jewish horror film. And it actually...
What's it called?
It honestly wasn't that good at the end, but still we should watch it to get its ratings up. But she is kind of a committed secular Jew. That is kind of the whole storyline, and it's all about Holocaust trauma. And she's having a baby, and there's things are going wrong. And one of her friends said to her, "God will protect your child," or "God will protect you." And she said, "No, the Jewish God is a vengeful God." And I paused it and I said to my partner, "That is Judaism." Because this woman has spent the last hour and a half telling us that she's secular and that she doesn't care about God, but she's still speaking about God almost as a fact, because that's what it is in the Jewish people. But we are a people with God, and even our God, even from an anthropological perspective, God, Yud He Vav He, is referred to as a national God, meaning a God for a specific people in a specific land. And that is quite a similar dynamic which exists for other Indigenous people. Aboriginal tribes in Australia, the Maori, obviously First Nations in the United States and Canada, God was linked to nature. So there are some secular Jews who say to me we shouldn't talk at all about God, we should only talk about archaeology. No, the fact that the Torah says that God promised us the land, that contributes to our indigeneity. The land is important, it is holy, and whether or not you believe in God or not is irrelevant, because the Jewish people have a God.
It reminds me of a story that I have a friend from grad school who used to be very anti-Israel. Today he's not. Not just because of me, but also a little. And I remember telling him about Masada and how much I love Masada. It's like one of my favorite places in Israel, and I take anyone who goes needs to go there. And it's like, there's so much history there. And he's like, well, is it like fake biblical history or is it actually history? And I'm like, wait, whoa, what did you just say? Like, the fake biblical history is actually history. And I think people don't understand that. They just don't, they don't have that concept that the things that happened in the Bible have like proof.
Yeah, and I actually had this conversation last night with a Catholic friend who lives in Boston, and we were talking about, she was talking about her perspective and the kind of trend of anti-religious bias which exists in kind of liberal secular circles. And that is another reason why the identification of Jews as a religion has been harmful, because we're lumped into that. Listen, it's probably disrespectful to other groups as well, like whatever, but that's obviously not my main concern. But you're right, there is this idea that Jewish history is based on belief, and I wrote this article recently, and the whole point is it's not actually about belief, it's truth, it's fact, it's archaeology, it's epigraphic evidence. I also love Masada, and I'm very pleased to hear you say this, because my partner and I are going to Israel this summer, and my sister who lives in Israel said, don't bother with Masada. And I was like, stop, yeah, it's amazing. And it is amazing, and going to the Kotel is amazing, because it's the Western Wall, it's real, you can touch it. And I think actually, it's one of the great privileges of being Jewish, that our community, our people, our history is so tangible. I can speak from a perspective as a gay person. When you're born into a gay community, by and large, you have to find a community, have to find your group. That's not the case with Jews. You're born into it, and then any town you go to, ever in the world, you meet someone and you have 2 degrees of separation. It truly is astonishing. I know this is a slight tangent, but I'll say it and then we'll get back to the questions. One of the most beautiful things I encountered post-October 7th was walking down the street in London or New York or wherever I was, and I wear a Magen David, I wear a kippah, usually I wear a yellow ribbon, and when other Jews would say Am Yisrael Chai to me, it made me want to cry. It's this incredible feeling of connectedness, and that is something we have. And we need to acknowledge it and activate it, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it, and we shouldn't be trying to warp or change ourselves to be accepted. You can be from the North Shore, this is what this area is called, right? Is that correct? The North Shore, and be Jewish. I'm very British in some ways. Love the king, love it, it's great, always go to take people to Buckingham Palace, but I'm also a Jew. And I don't need to choose, I don't need to compromise. I can live authentically wherever I am, as authentically who I am.
I love that you mentioned that when you kind of went across the street, because even the other day, I was in like Starbucks, or I don't even know where, but like not a Jewish place, and I saw this kid, and he was working there, and he wore a Magen David, and I looked at it, I didn't say anything, and then when I left, I was like your necklace, and I walked away, and I think like, it's amazing how we spot each other, we inspire each other and give that like little strength. I couldn't not say anything, like I felt like I had to. But okay, coming back from the tangent, some misconceptions about indigeneity, right? It's a packed topic to these days, politicized, maybe even more than just politics plays into that, a lot of other things. And I wonder kind of what are the misconceptions that you've come across, both just in general, but also as it portrays specifically to Jewish indigeneity?
So I have a mentor called Winston, who's one of the interviewees in the new book. I always interview Jewish people because I write about Jewish identity, so you have to see how these ideas play out in real people. And he sent me an article 2 years ago when I just was sitting down to the research, and it was an article from the New Yorker that said, "Is it time to rethink indigeneity?" And I thought, bloody hell, Winston, like now is not the time. But actually, I was so grateful because it was what gave me the framework of how to talk about how politicized indigeneity is. And it's really unfortunate. We have 3 main ideas, or 3 main misconceptions when it comes to indigeneity. The first is firstness. The notion that a people have to be first in a land to be considered indigenous. It's not the case, actually. The Greenlandic population, actually we'll talk about them later, let's talk about the Maasai from Masai Mara. They are identified as indigenous, they identify themselves as indigenous, they only arrived in that territory in about the 17th century. And there are people who are from Iceland, and the descendants of the Vikings and the priests who first went there, they're not considered to be indigenous. So firstness is a really complicated topic, and also the simple fact that humans migrate, we all actually originated from the same part of the world. So firstness has to be put to the side. The other two are probably more harmful. And the first one is, or the second one I should say, is primitiveness. And many of us, when you talk about an Indigenous people, you conjure up an image of your mind, and it's a tribal person in a field with a spear. That is often what people think. And what that does is trap Indigenous people in a very specific box. It strips them of their agency. And these are ideas which are not just my critique. I was reading, obviously, non-Jewish Indigenous people's perspectives, and there's a lot of criticism of these ideas, because why can't an Indigenous person be sitting in a tower block with a Bluetooth headset, right? Maybe I'm showing my age there by talking about Bluetooth. Or on their iPhone. Why can't they? There's no reason. So again, we trap them in boxes, and the last one is particularly harmful. And it's just, I think it's a bit gross, and it's the notion that Indigenous people are inherently oppressed. Now, of course, we know that Indigenous people have often been oppressed, have often been colonized, but the notion that they are, or we are, inherently oppressed, again, strips our agency away from us. Why can't we be powerful? Why can't we be the majority? That's the thing about Greenland. So I think 85 or 89% of the Greenlandic population that your president wants to buy, so maybe they'll become your countrymen at some point, but the Greenlandic population is 89 or 85% Inuit. So they're the majority. They're in charge. There are no reservations in Greenland. They live on their land and they practice their customs. They're not oppressed. And I think it's a really dangerous idea. And for me, it's the manifestation of the racism of low expectations, that we trap specific groups in these boxes. And it's often about a savior complex. And how that relates to Jews is it leads Jews, often liberal Jews, to reject the term of indigeneity because they don't want to appropriate the indigenous struggle. I mean, that is a literal quote from someone that I mentioned in the book. And that's absurd, because again, what do you mean inherent, like the indigenous struggle? Of course, listen, we were colonized. We're probably the original colonized people, and yes, in 1948, we decolonized. But why are we not encouraging all indigenous people to do that? Why are we not giving resources and tools and empowerment to indigenous people? Because it suits people to trap them in reservations, I mean, quite literally, right? And it's incredibly harmful, and it leads Jews to misunderstand how this idea pertains to us.
Wow, okay. So you started with Trump, and I'm gonna kind of go on that trail. In 2019, President Trump signed an executive order that essentially put ethno-religions in line with national origin discrimination. So it was specifically Jewish people, there were Sikhs as well, I think there were a few others. And for someone like me who fights anti-Semitism, this was like amazing, because it allowed to finally label anti-Zionism and anti-Israel as a form of anti-Semitism, also as a hate crime and discriminatory. But at the time, and still, it was a hugely controversial thing with Jews as well. There was a lot of opposition to it, and I want to hope that it wasn't just because it was Trump that signed it, and I'm curious why you think all this opposition comes from Jews in the diaspora to this idea.
I remember that happening, and it was funny because in the UK, Jew hatred is defined as racism. So it's a racist hate crime if you experience anti-Semitism in the street. So I always found that really interesting. I think that Jews in the diaspora, and I think particularly in the United States, but also in other places, are really terrified of Jewish difference. We are a unique set of people. We are different. And different is, again, it's like when I was a kid, being a minority. It's not good or bad, it just is. We are different. And so are the Arabs and the Sikhs and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Vietnamese and the whoever's have come to this country or any other country, right? We're a unique set of people, but Jews are terrified. And it kind of makes sense that we are, because of the very long and very real genocidal Jew hatred that we've experienced in our history. But that has led Jews to assimilate over integrate. So integration is a good thing. I think that, we're all having conversations about immigration now across the world, and also in the UK. We talk about immigration. And it's like, I want immigrants to come to the UK, but I think they should integrate. I don't think they should be expected to assimilate. Assimilate is when you shed everything which makes you unique. And there were Jews who came to this country and there was pressure to do that. And also the way the system worked. I mean, Dara Horn spoke about this, that the myth that the names were changed on Ellis Island. It's not true. We know it's not true. The names were changed laterally. My grandfather, my mum's maiden name was Samuels. Her father was the first of his brothers and sisters to be born in Scotland. The rest were born in Eastern Europe. He changed his name in like the 30s from Shmulevitz to Samuels, right? We want to integrate, we want to assimilate, we want to fit in. We're scared of being marked as different. And I think that has led Jews to deny our truth. I think I say in my second book that we've become a people of denial because there are simple facts. We are different. You know, one of the reasons I love hosting non-Jewish people for Rosh Hashanah or Pesach or Shabbat is because I'm sharing my culture with them. And it's a real, tangible culture. It's not just Jewish coded like Friends, right? Rachel Green is a character from the show Friends. She's Jewish coded. Really what they're saying is she's a white person with a quirk. No, this is not a quirk. We belong to an ancient civilization, and we sitting in this hall today are a miracle. The fact that we get to sit here and have a conversation about Jewish identity in 2025 is mind-blowing. Think about our ancestors. They'd be blown away by this. The fact that we're just sitting here, there's something very real and beautiful and distinct about Jewishness. But Jews have been made to be afraid of it. I think that's a large part of it. And it's interesting to see how people talk about it. And one of the kind of rhetorics I've seen post-October 7th is, we are different, and the world will never let us forget that we're not different. And I think that's true, but I also don't like that. It's negative. We need to be rooting and hooking our identity on the positive, on our indigeneity, on our traditions, on our peoplehood, on our connection, which is all real. We're not white people with a quirk.
I like that, white people with a quirk. We're not white passing, as they say, right?
Sure.
I mean, I'm Iraqi.
Yeah, I mean, I know what I look like. I'm not an idiot. Like, I'm also the lightest one in my family. Like, I'll show you, if you stick around, I'll show you a picture of my brother later on. He looks like he's walked straight out of the pictures of the Torah, the pages of the Torah. It's like kind of crazy that I look the way I do and he looks the way he does. But that's how the genetic cookie crumbles. But yeah, and I know I pass as white, but to pass as something is not the same as being. That's kind of the whole point. And I find in my work, my trump cards, is that what you say? Is that a phrase? Right? I mean, no, it's not a thing you say.
Don't ask him Israeli.
Is that a phrase, right?
Yes.
Thank you. My trump card is that I'm gay. Because I can talk about passing in a gay sense. And actually, to pass as a gay person is often unbelievably harmful. And it doesn't mean that you escape prejudice because you're still coping and dealing with your own internalized hate. And you still experience what happens in the world, even if it's not directed at you. So, to be a Jew and to pass certainly allows us to circumvent certain experiences, but it doesn't stop us experiencing Jew hatred.
It's funny, you mentioned it about your brother. I mean, my siblings and I look very much like our Ashkenazi father, but my husband, both of us are half Ashkenazi, half Mizrahi, and people here would say that he's a POC, person of color. Like people, his secretary once was like, you know you're black. And he's like, no, I'm not. But it's so funny because he gets to pull that card whenever he wants to. And I'm like, seriously? We literally have the same kind of half and half. And it's really a thing. It's really how I think a lot of people, a lot of Jews, especially younger Jews, and I think post-October 7th it's changed, were kind of ashamed of their whiteness, and they kind of took that as a bigger piece of their identity than their Judaism, understanding that like Jews are white passing, as you say, like, I mean, they're not.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And they were made to feel ashamed. They were made to check their Jewishness and their Zionism at the door. And that really is what's happened on the left. And you know, we met 5 years ago now, that was during COVID. These conversations, what's happening post-October 7th was happening before October 7th. It was happening 4 or 5 years ago. It's just reached a fever pitch right now. But yes, there have been people who've been forced to feel, but it's also the case for non-Jews, right? Real white people, real live white people. My British white friends, it's really the word I would use is they've been neutered. it's a very fascinating thing to watch, especially in the UK. We're talking about Islamic extremism, and particularly in Europe. It's fascinating to see the response, and they're not able to stand up for being British and to say, if you come to Britain, you should integrate and you should not try and blow us up. But they really find it impossible because they've been so conditioned into thinking, to be terrified and apologetic of their so-called privilege.
And being labeled as racist. And I find it very interesting that in Britain, anti-Jewish hate crimes are considered to be racism, because here there's kind of a category. The FBI does not categorize it as ethnicity or as racism. They categorize it as religious hate crimes. And the absurdity is, if you take the numbers and compare them to racism against Black people, for example, per capita, I mean, there's more cases of anti-Semitism than there is of racism. It's really mind-boggling. It's something that people just don't really understand. And I want to kind of continue that the anti-Semitism card which really ties into this, and we've seen it, I think, after October 7th. So many Jews have woken up on this specific topic, because it used to be, okay, I can be anti-Zionist, or Israel doesn't apply to me, I can be Jewish without Israel, and all of a sudden, it didn't matter if you were for Israel, against Israel, if you hated Bibi, if you loved Bibi, you were hated, and you were marked because you were Jewish, and it's just like very interesting that I think it kind of dropped. But I wanna actually ask you about the internalized anti-Semitism, because I feel it's still there. Like, we still see it. We have JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace, if not now, all of the fun Jewish groups that are great. And how do you explain that? I mean, you talked about how it portrays to like the self-hate and gay, in like the gay community, and I'm curious because I've never heard that before.
It's incredibly difficult to explain it, because if you have internalized hate, you're probably not aware that you have internalized hate. It's like, that's kind of the kicker. So it's very difficult. But we as a community are generations behind other communities. A story, a quick anecdote, if you will. My friend Grant was on vacation with his friends, Scott, and Scott's boyfriend, Cedric. Grant is also a gay man. And Cedric is at the basket case and was kind of having a very difficult time coping with being a gay man, basically. Was in a relationship with a guy, obviously, but was still deeply uncomfortable about RuPaul's Drag Race and kind of things which marked gay people or gay men as distinct or separate.
Eurovision.
Yeah, precisely, we love Eurovision. And Grant was messaging me, and he said, like, oh, Cedric is really having a hard time with his internalized homophobia. And I knew exactly what he was talking about. I understood precisely, because there is a dialogue about this in the gay community. There's a dialogue about it even amongst women in the Black community. For some reason, as Jews, I think it's because as Jews, our experiences, many of them are so awful that we don't have the capacity to open the box and to start investigating. Because I think that many of us would find it an immensely painful and difficult process. And also, even if we think about post-Shoah, what were the survivors doing? They came to this country and they built lives, or they built a state in Israel. They had to get married, they had to find jobs, they had to recreate, because they'd lost everything. There was no time for reflection and for sitting and considering, well, how did this impact us? And I think, though, that is a major criticism I have of the entire study of anti-Semitism. Because there's lots of theoretical conversations. Do we call it anti-Semitism? Do we call it anti-Judaism? Do you call it anti-Jewish racism? And in all of these conversations, they fail to understand the impact it had on real Jews at whichever time they're discussing. The deportations, the expulsions, the conversions, the murder, the oppression, whichever it was, how did that play out in the lives of real Jews? And that is what we have to understand, is how does this play out in our lives? How has October 7th impacted us? But not just October 7th, that's the extreme. What has it been like to navigate the world as a Jew? And I speak to a lot of Jews, and the first thing they say is, well, I don't think I've ever experienced much Jew hatred. And then the conversation goes on a little bit, and they're like, well, my best friend's little brother was like, well, I never experienced Jew hatred at school, but people did throw pennies at my feet. And I was like, Carter, that's kind of like the anti-Semitism. Like, what are you talking about? and I think that again that connects to the Holocaust. The Holocaust is held as this. That's what anti-Semitism is. So anything that we experience is less than. It's not as important. Therefore, we're not going to talk about it. But we do internalize it because that's just what happens if you're a human being. And what we need to understand, and I think American Jews specifically have woken up to this idea. You guys are a minority. And I know maybe you feel it here, but I've spoken at communities and you see the eyes widen when I say that in Los Angeles or New York. They're like, what do you mean we're a minority? It's like, again, my maths is really bad, but what, 7 million Jews is less than 350 million people, a literal minority. But like you were talking about at the beginning, this desire to be accepted, this desire to be assimilated, this desire to become white, that was the system that existed here, to shed our Jewishness, or to have it as a religion, to have it as a quirk. And that idea lives on.
I think that you're talking about like anti-Semitism and internalized anti-Semitism and people not noticing that they experience it. And I think that another thing is that Jews have historically, at least in the United States and in many other areas in the diaspora today, not at the time of the Holocaust, but have been what we call kind of punched up, as opposed to being punched down. As opposed to being, okay, so other slurs that you think when you think about racism, you think of negative things. And for Jews, it was more of the positive things. You're strong, you control the world, you're good with money, you control the banks. And I think for people that were like, wait, is this might be something that's a compliment. I mean, or they're complimenting me. Why would I see this as something bad? And I think that that's also something that needed to be trained. You know, when someone tells you that because you're a Jew, you're good with money, you should be the treasurer of your club. Probably not a great thing. Okay, so I want to ask this tricky question, which you do talk about a little bit in the book. And it portrays to converts, right? We have many people, well not like many, but there are people that decide to become Jews. It's a cognizant decision that they make. It's a very difficult process. And they're very committed to it. And one would say that if we're so tied into this Jewish indigenuity, then if you convert, you're never truly Jewish. So how do you explain that? How do you talk about that? How do you make people who converted to feel like they are part of?
So there's two ways to think about that. And we're going to park the reframing of conversion for a second, but we will get to that. If I forget, you can just remind me. But in terms of indigeneity, there are some indigenous tribes across the world who really utilize genetics. Blood quantum in this country and in Canada also was a very controversial thing, a very controversial policy, but some indigenous tribes still utilize it. And it's really, it's not dissimilar to the Nuremberg laws, actually. It's how much indigenous blood you have. There are some communities, however, who completely reject it and who say, no, that the idea of blood quantum is genocide, because as people intermarry, the amount of indigenous blood you have will decrease, and therefore you will at some point stop being indigenous. So the idea of it, or the notion of genetics within the conversation of indigeneity is quite controversial and quite tricky. Then if we refer to the United Nations, they've got 7 criteria. That is what forms the bulk of the proof that I have delivered in this book. It's assessing how we fit into the United Nations 7 criteria. Not once does it reference genetics. Not once. There are also other indigenous tribes that have a form of initiation. The Maori have it, tribes in this country have it, where you can join the tribe. You can become a member of the tribe, literally. So that exists. And then the last thing to say about that is one of the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people says that Indigenous people have the right to create and manage their own membership criteria. We're allowed to say, even if no other people in the world allowed conversion, we're allowed to say, we allow conversion, and we're still Indigenous. So again, don't tell us who and what we are. Then the next part would be reframing indigeneity. And I have a section in the last chapter of the book, and I hope you will all read it and love it and get to this section, because I worked very hard particularly on this section. It was a bit of a nightmare. And it was about Judaism as an indigenous culture, not as a religion. And I have Winston, who I spoke about, the gentleman in the book, I have him on speed dial, a couple of other rabbis, that I was calling up because I really wanted to get to the root of how we understand conversion, how we understand the religious law or the law, and then what it pertains to us as a religion or people or whatever we might be. And then a rabbi, who's actually the first interview in the book, Rabbi Isaac Chawa, and he said to me, let's think about Ruth. Ruth is the most famous convert, and the fact that Ruth was included is very important, because the process of codifying the Torah, sometimes some books were included, other times they were taken out. There's a Jewish historian called Flavius Josephus, and he spoke about, I think, 22 or 24 books. We had 22 books. So it's like, well, what were those 2 other books, Josephus? Like, which were they? Because it was a process. But the fact that Ruth was included and is the great-great-grandmother of King David shows the importance that we attribute to converts, right? It's not a thing that we're pushing to the side, it's a main part of the story. But let's think about Ruth. What does Ruth say? Your people are my people, your God is my God. So there is a religious element there if we talk about God. But again, we're thinking about a time where you were not separating God from society, from people, from land. And what Ruth, in my opinion, was really saying is, your people are my people, your land is my land. So what did Ruth do? I don't think Ruth converted. I think that Ruth naturalized as a citizen. And it is not a citizen like she had a passport, but she became a part of the Am, part of the Jewish people. And in the final, or the penultimate chapter, when I go over Winston's story, I realized that Winston went on a process, he went on a journey of learning and of understanding, and he arrived at indigeneity. And it's not that Winston's individual roots come from Israel, they actually come from this part of the world. But he, in becoming a Jew, has become indigenous, because the Jews as a collective are indigenous. So anyone that uses converts as a way to diminish Jewish indigeneity, it's poppycock, it's absolutely ridiculous. And we also, again, need to reorient our understanding, not just of conversion, but of Judaism at large. And of course, if you're a convert, you will have changed your religion, because yes, we have a religious element. So there's complexity, and there's nuance, and there's duality. But ultimately, a convert is supposed to have been there with us at Sinai. The kind of formation of the Jewish people, right? That's why Pesach is such an important story. That's when we became a people, and we're going to our land. And the converts were there with us. So they are Jewish, they're just as connected to the land as we are. That's it.
Okay, so last question before I open it up to the audience. So start thinking about if you have any questions. Your book is very targeted, in my opinion, to kind of the in-group, to us, to Jews, to fellow Jews, to kind of teach them this concept. How do you think we should talk about it with people outside of the Jewish world? What do you find works, and what do you think resonates with people?
I think authenticity. Tell your story. And your story is connected to this, but also you have your own story that I can hear whether else you make it. But when I speak to non-Jews, and I've got a lot of non-Jewish friends, my partner's not Jewish, I went to Glasgow University where there was literally 2 Jews, so most of my closest friends are not Jewish. And even with them, and these are people because I am older than I look, I'm 38, so even though I've known these people—
You're so old!
I feel old. So my partner's 2 months older than me.
I'm 39, so—
Oh, I was gonna say it. My partner's 2 months older than me, so I'm always like, whoa.
You're huge.
Thank you for saying that. When I speak to my non-Jewish friends, and these people who are really dear to my heart, I do so with real boundaries. And I say a couple of things to them, and I invite conversation. And honestly, I kind of think, I'm very political. I like talking about this. I think it can be quite intense for people, but a lot of my friends are like this as well. Like, we like to get into it and talk about current affairs and politics. So these are people who want to discuss stuff like this. And I say to them, before we begin a conversation, let's just set some boundaries in place. And there's a couple of things we should acknowledge. One of them, and I say this to them, is I know more than you do. And I'm not being an asshole, I just do. And I hope I do, because this is my job. And just as my friends know about financial services, or beer, or champagne, or whatever industry they work in, I know more about this than they do. So I'm like, come at me with some respect. Number 2, and this is probably more important, I care more than you do. This is my life, it's my people, it's my literal family, my siblings live in Israel, I've got nephews and nieces who will one day serve in the IDF. It's all of us. There's a real deep emotional connection that I think many kind of average, in Britain at least, many average white people in Britain don't really understand. There isn't this connection that they have to other British people. We have something very special. So I say to them, I care more than you do. So when you have this conversation with me, I'm not actually talking politics, I'm talking about my life, I'm talking about how my people are treated, and the BBC is always a topic of conversation. And the BBC is, for many non-Jews, it's like a kind of a pillar of British life, and it was something we all grew up on. And even when I was a kid, the BBC, you knew that was quality television. And a lot of non-Jewish people are blind to what is going on because it's not necessarily reported or they choose to ignore it. So my friend was talking about how much he loved the BBC, and I was like, Richard, his name is Richard, I won't give you his last name because that would be unfair. I was like, the BBC is being accused of collaborating basically with Hamas on this documentary. And I know that you have nothing to do with this and you're not talking about this, but you have to understand that it makes me feel unsafe in this country. It makes me feel that even though I'm a British citizen, that I'm British. That I'm not really British, that I'm British because there's really a part of the population and a part of the establishment which thinks that I don't matter. And I think boundaries are so important. And I think that comes with pride, it comes with a self-confidence to say, excuse me, don't speak to me like this. It's one of the best things about social media. I love to block people. You know, people come on and they're like, I wish you were dead. It's like, okay, well, I'm not going to have a discussion with you because I disagree. No, get out of here. But also in my real life, there are people who I've told that's the interesting thing about being with a non-Jewish guy. So my partner Gary is an unbelievable ally. He worked at a Jewish school, so we're kind of an unusual partnership. But I have curated non-Jewish friends who are great allies. He never really had to do that, right? Because we've been together 8 years, but still it still was a process. So there are friends of his that I say, they're not allowed in my home. I will not see them. And I was like, I'm not saying that you can't have a relationship with them. You can, but I will have nothing to do with them until you decide to have a conversation with them about why I'm not interacting with them. And you can or you can't, right? Like, it's totally fine. I'm not really upset I'm not hanging out with these people. But boundaries is really important. We have a right to feel safe. We have a right to center ourselves. And that's what you said. This book is for Jews. All of my work is for Jews. And I want non-Jews to read it, and I think that's wonderful, but I'm writing for Jews because actually, selfishness is okay, and selfishness gets a bad reputation as a concept, but we should put our little masks on first, right, in an aeroplane. That's what we need to do. We need to take care of ourselves, we need to take care of each other. And then yes, if we feel comfortable, let's share the information with our friends and our colleagues. But I don't like this idea that, okay guys, you're going to read this book, everyone's going to read it, right, yep. You all have to go and tell a non-Jewish person. That makes me feel uncomfortable. You get to decide what you do with it. Sometimes you may want to, maybe you won't want to talk about non-Jewish people, but if you do, you should have a sense of confidence, sense of self-esteem, sense of self-respect to say, excuse me, who do you think you are to say that to me? And I'm actually not a particularly confrontational person, but I've learned to advocate. And not just advocate online, because in some ways that's easier. I can do my little Twitter and my Instagram and write my books and it's private. No, what has been a greater demonstration of my growth and my pride is communication I've had with non-Jewish friends and putting those boundaries in place. And not talking about it. I talk about this all the time. Like every time my friends and I get together, we talk about stuff like this because they need to know. They need to understand what is happening. Like one of my friends was like, so what's it like in academia now for Jews? I said there was a USC, there was a very prestigious British university that launched a book that's basically called Understanding Hamas. And it's about, Hamas, poor Hamas. It's like, no, you need to know this is happening, and that's actually my friend's alma mater. She needs to know, because this stuff isn't being reported on the news, and that is kind of a role we play, unfortunately, to our non-Jewish friends, is the news. But if you decide, if you don't decide, even if it's internal, it's always with pride, it's always with self-confidence, it's always with a sense of who we are, that we're allowed to center ourselves. And people say that we center ourselves, yeah, we're going to center ourselves. Because if we're not allowed to talk about who we are and our experience, then what are you talking about? It's insane. What we're asking for, what we're thinking of, are rights and respect given to many other communities, but not us. So we're not going to ask for it, we're taking it. We're going to take up the space which is ours to claim. We're going to communicate with our non-Jewish friends if we see fit, but we're going to do so as proud Jews. We're not going to shrink and say, well, you know, no. Let me tell you what it means to be a Jew. Let me explain to you what our connection to the land of Israel is.
Love it. Thank you, Ben. This is fascinating. More fun than I thought it would be, actually. Questions?
Very brave, thank you, sir.
First of all, I like your towels. It's very nice.
It's chilly.
Well, you talked about your Scottish background. Where did your, I'm not talking about the ancestors from 5,000 years ago, but where did your ancestors come from?
So most of the population of Scotland are Ashkenazi, and we believed a lie for a long time. We thought that the Jews were tricked, because quite frankly, who would want to go to Scotland? Like, I mean, Scotland's beautiful, but it's kind of a weird place for Jews to have gone. So we thought that they were tricked. I found out not that long ago that they were not tricked, that the journey was supposed to be done in 2 parts. Maybe they couldn't afford a direct trip to the United States, so they paid for a trip to Scotland, and they would have arrived on the west coast. Is that west for you guys? Whatever. It's not a geography class. They would arrive on the west coast. Most of the Jews live on the east coast, in Glasgow, where I'm from. So they made their way over, and some did leave, some went to North America, but many stayed. And it's a very small community, but that is the story. So it was the end of the 19th century because of the pogroms.
One more question. Do you classify yourself as Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, or do you not classify yourself as anything? Because I noticed you mentioned you've talked to some rabbis. Well, it makes a difference. What they, where they belong.
So I was raised Reform, and I'm a member of a Reform show now, but I'm Jewish. So with this book, the people I spoke to a Reform rabbi, I spoke to a gay Reform rabbi who used to be very Orthodox and who kind of moved into the Reform world when he came out. Rabbi Isaac Choa, the first interview, he's a Lebanese rabbi, and it's Sephardic, and it's a very different tradition. And a rabbi called Rabbi Jeremy Rosen, who is also Ashkenazi, and I think Rabbi Isaac and Rabbi Jeremy are Orthodox. I'm a Jew, and to me, the way I see Torah and the way I see that study is academic. That's how I think that we should approach it. So I wanted to speak to people who I thought had the academic credentials.
Thank you.
I often get offended when filling applications that ask you, are you white, Hispanic white, non-Hispanic white, and sometimes they put ethnicity, and then there's an other. Depending on how confrontational I am, I've started to put other because I really do feel that way. The problem is that right under the other, if you put other, there's a blank box that says, please explain, which I usually don't want to, but now I know what I'm going to say. Read Ben Freeman's book.
That'd be great.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Love a plug.
Thank you, Ben. This is very thoughtful, and I identify with a lot of things that you say. It's very interesting. I'm a Russian-American Jew, so I had to do some assimilation and integration, and it's very interesting what you're saying. I actually assimilated, I think, more than integrated, and made a lot of effort to do that just by the virtue of my job, and not to stick out too much with my accent and whatnot. But I actually need help. I need your opinion on something. At the place of work, our ethnicity of my co-workers has changed a lot over the years, and I find myself now working with a lot of Middle Eastern employees and workers who have names that I know they come somewhere from the Middle East, less likely from Israel and more likely from Arabic-speaking countries. And before October 7th, I just looked at them as my co-workers, and now I look at them as my potential adversaries, or somebody who may not be very friendly. They knew what my stand is on Israel and on the Middle Eastern relations, and I wonder, you probably also come across those things in England and in Scotland, and what is your thoughts? What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's something that Jews all over the world are experiencing. And there's a TV show on right now called Severance. Have you guys heard of it? It's very big. I think it's a little boring, to be honest about it.
You have to get through the first
Yeah,
one.
you
Yeah, you have to get like the last episode for the first
Yeah, you have to get through it, which I'm not here for. But it's the concept is your work self and your personal self are split. So when you go to work, you can remember nothing of your personal life, and when you go home, you can remember nothing of your work life. It's like taking the work-life balance to an extreme. It's kind of dystopian. And I spoke to someone the other day she works for UJ in Toronto, and she was talking about her husband, who works, I guess, in the corporate world. And she said that he has described being a Jew in the corporate world as being severed. Meaning that all of this stuff, all of the things that we're talking about, thinking about, you sometimes have to leave at the door. And I think it's a very difficult situation. I think that, and I think actually, it's one of the reasons that DEI at its core is not a bad thing. I think it's a shame what has happened with DEI. Like at its core, I think it's a good thing. We should make efforts to make our workspaces and our schools safe and welcoming for all people. The problem is we know that's not how it's gone, and it's certainly not included Jews. It's a very difficult thing, and you have to kind of work out how you want to proceed. What I want to give you is empathy, and really say you're not alone, this is happening everywhere. And I think it also depends on how senior you are at work, right? Are the people who are coming in, are they showing symbols? Are they expressing views? Because if they're not, then you kind of have to leave them be. But I think this is a reality that, listen, I say this to my partner, the demographics of London have changed enormously. Like London is really in some ways a completely different place than it used to be. And that does impact how I feel there. It does impact how connected I feel to other Brits. And that's a simple fact for me. But I think that there's nothing wrong with that because we're responding to the reality of the situation. And I think we should be empathetic to ourselves. So the fact that you're maybe seeing some of these people as your adversaries, listen, I think in a professional capacity, one has to be professional, but I think you shouldn't beat yourself up for thinking that because you might be right. And even if you're wrong, there's a reason why you think it. It's not just racism, it's not just prejudice, it's that we know that the Muslim community and the Arabic community is positioned against us. Whether they are or they aren't, that's the narrative. And I think it's probably true in actually many situations, to be honest. But I think what you need to do is protect yourself. Again, focus on you, focus on protecting yourself. Make sure that you have an outlet. Because I'm lucky in a sense, this is my job. I talk about this all day long. And when I meet other Jews, they often want to talk to me about it because they don't have anyone else to talk to. They want to share, they want to say, are you experiencing this? And I can say that, even though my work is different, loads and loads and loads of Jews all over the world are experiencing what you're experiencing. In the NHS in the UK, in medical associations in Toronto, in Canada, it's become a very difficult situation. And I think we have to have a big dialogue, an ongoing dialogue, about how long we put up with it for. And I really don't know, that's not me saying we should not make Aliyah tomorrow, but I think that it should be an active conversation, because if you're made to feel uncomfortable at work, that's unacceptable. So I mean that also, but I didn't really give you any advice there, I'm sorry.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for coming out. It's a real pleasure to hear you. My question for you was, I was hoping you could talk more about Jewish peoplehood and what that means to you. Do you think that as a people we should be all subscribing to sort of like a standard set of ideals and beliefs and practices, or can it be up for interpretation for each individual? And also, as that pertains to converts, I mean, I'm the daughter of a convert who's very, very involved and like speaks writes and understands people fluently. I think my father is the exception probably, but he's very involved, so I would consider him like he's one of the people. He's like a Jew, but I was wondering if you could just talk about that more and how you think like we can define a Jewish people.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we don't have creed, and that is what separates us from Christianity and Islam, and why they're faiths and we're not. Like, I think that we should drop the notion that Jews are a faith. I think we should not talk about interfaith. We should talk about intercultural. Jews are not a religion. We're not a faith. We have Emanu-El, which is a ancient Hebrew concept, which is translated to faith, but it's ancient Hebrew, right? It's a completely different term to the way faith is used in the modern or Christian world. Yeah, it's exactly. It's belief, and belief and faith are different things. So I think that we shouldn't have creed, but I do think that we should have boundaries. And I think that that has to be rooted in what I would call fact or truth. What is Israel? And one can hate Netanyahu, love him, one can go to Israel all the time or not. None of that changes the fact that Israel is the cradle of Jewish life, right? It just is. It seems, I shouldn't have had to write this book. Like my friend yesterday, my Catholic friend, was like, why did you write that book? Isn't it obvious? I was like, yeah, to you, but unfortunately, not to a lot of other people. Although maybe people turn around and be like, duh. But it should be based on fact. That idea, Israel is the home of Jewish civilization. Israel is the center of Jewish civilization. From a diversity of thought perspective, that is what the Jews are. Even think about, I was talking about this yesterday with my friend, the time of Roman rule around the time that Jesus was living in Israel, the factions, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and there's another one I always forget. There's a fourth, whatever. The Zealots. But we've always disagreed. Because when you start to make the law prescriptive law, but this is actually how we live our lives, there's then becomes interpretation of how we live our lives. What does the law really mean? That's why we have the Talmud, right? So we're always a people who have discussed, who have debated, who have had dialogue. And that's why when you study Talmud today, you do it in pairs, because you have someone to discuss it with. So I think that is a really wonderful part of our culture and our civilization. But I do think that we should have boundaries. And again, particularly pertaining to Israel. And I think part of the issue is, and it's not an issue, part of the reality, let's say, is that we live in a time of kind of fractured Jewish identity, not just with relation to Israel, but we have Orthodox, we have Reform, we have Liberal, we have Conservative or Majority, we have Reconstructionists, we have Humanists, we have all of these different types of Jewishness. So one of the things that I call for, which is changed the post-October 7th, is I think we should cherem, excommunicate, the key leader anti-Zionist Jews. I don't think we need to say to them, no, you're not under our tent, you're not in our club. But the question is, from a legal perspective, and we have to think about the Torah in legal terms, who does that? When Spinoza was excommunicated, poor guy, it was the Jews. There was no, hundreds of different Jewish splinter groups. So that is tricky, but I do think we have to come together. And I think that we have to have boundary conversations. And I think it should be based on fact, based on our texts. Even if we say, okay, we disagree with this, the conversation has to be based on what is written, not misinterpretation. I was raised Reform. The idea of Tikkun Olam by the Reform community is a complete misunderstanding. Let's put our student hats on. If a kid wrote an essay to me, in my old teaching days, if a kid wrote an essay for me and they spoke about Tikkun Olam in social justice terms, I would fail them. Because it's a failure in textual analysis. We need to root ourselves into learning, and that's what Winston does. Winston, my mentor who's in the book, who converted, what he shows us is that we as Jews can never stop learning. It doesn't matter if you're born Jewish or if you convert, we are all on this journey all the time to learn more, and we should be actively engaging with it. And I think that is the essence, this way of life. One more anecdote and then we'll move on. I'm not really a big showgoer, right? I don't really go to shul that often, but my mum does, or did. So for her 75th birthday last year, she wanted to go to shul in the morning. So I went with her in Scotland. And my partner messaged me afterwards to be like, how was it? And I think he thought I was going to be like, oh, it was kind of boring, whatever. And I was like, it was amazing. And he was like, are you becoming fruit on me? Because I have increased my Jewish activity since we've been together. And I said, no, it was an expression of our indigeneity. We were Jews in Scotland, and we were reading the Torah in Hebrew with a Scottish accent. We were calling people up for Aliyah with a Scottish accent, and we were reading the same parsha that every other Jewish community in the world is reading. We look around the synagogue and you have menorah, you have ner tamid, you have Arona Kodesh, the exact same tangible things that are in every other synagogue around the world. And I think those aspects is what we root our peoplehood into. But they're not flimsy, they come from something, the instruction from the law. I think that we are a civilization based on law. That is how we should see the Torah. Because the instruction for Shabbat, the instruction for Yom Kippur, yes, of course there's a religious element because it's supposed to be written by God, but it's law. And it was used as law. And that is the most incredible thing. And really what I learned after writing this book was that obviously we're so different in many ways from our ancient ancestors, but in other ways we're not. They celebrated Shabbat, we celebrate Shabbat, and maybe in different ways. But the fact that we're still doing it, that continuity, and that is something, that is indigeneity. And some people come for me and they say, well, you know what, this is not the first book on indigeneity because there's all of these books about archaeology. I mean, archaeology does not prove indigeneity, it's a part of it. What it proves is there was an ancient people living in the land thousands of years ago. What it does not prove is that we are the same people today. It's that continuity piece. And diversity of thought's wonderful, we will debate, we will dialogue, but it should be rooted in boundaries. And I don't know, and that someone commented on Instagram talking about Messianic Jews. And they were like, well, if you are a people, then I should be able to be considered Jewish. I was like, listen, you could be genetically Jewish, but you've kind of rejected the main Jewish principle, which is monotheism. Like, if you think that Jesus is God, then how can you say Shema Yisrael Melech Echad? Right, that is the Jewish principle. So, aligning ourselves along our basic principles, and then our basic truths. And then we go from there and have our discussions, I think.
I'm curious as to, I assume kids still go to afternoon Hebrew school. It's been a while since mine did, but anyhow, what would a curriculum, what would your curriculum look like? Grades 1 through 8, I think? Yeah.
So thank you for asking that, because I have that on my laptop, because I was a teacher. And mine is, I guess, grade 1 through 12. And when you educate, especially in a school setting, it's building blocks, right? And grade 12, the last year, that is the highest tower, because you've been able to build the foundations, and you're able to then put on the nuance and put on the complexity. And as you go down, it gets simpler. But what we have to do is start explaining, or rather, let me rephrase this, what we have to do is start owning and explaining our identities. I mean, I think indigeneity should be the official position of the Jewish world. I think it's astonishing that Israel does not say that it's our indigenous land and we're the indigenous people. And they do that because it's through a religious lens, right? I think what we have to do is you have to teach all of this. So Jewish pride, you have to teach indigeneity, you have to teach peoplehood, and you have to do it in an age-appropriate way. And so you can do that through teaching the festivals and helping the students understand that, you know, we're eating apple and honey today. Jews have been eating apple and honey for thousands of years. Or we're sitting in our sukkah outside in the cold in Scotland, and Jews were sitting in their sukkot, right, plural? Yeah. Sukkot, for thousands of years. It's that continuity, because that's the peoplehood, that's the feeling, because pride is a feeling. And that's where this becomes tricky, right? How are we going to get people to understand or feel this feeling? And we're not trying to teach it, we're trying to cultivate it. So you start simple, and then you build. The structure of my curriculum is based on my book. So the first lesson, or the first series of lessons, about indigeneity. And it really is a reframing of Jewish identity, moving away from the notion that we're a religion. And the idea, for example, that the word Jewish, right? Jewish. In Old English, Jew means from Judea, and Ish means someone from a specific place. So to say I'm Jewish means I'm from the place of Jews. So what's in a name? For us, it's everything. So you have to teach all of this, but you do it in a way which is, it's progressive. So you have indigeneity, and then once you've done that, once you've grounded Jewish identity on civilization, on Israel, on peoplehood, on Torah, and all of that, you can then talk about Jew hatred. So you explain that. But then what we have to discuss is, what is the impact of Jew hatred on Jews? So not just loss of income, murder, what is the psychological impact? Because what we do then is begin the conversations with our young people to say, we're allowed to have these conversations, we're allowed to dialogue, you're allowed to investigate your Jewishness, and when you do it without shame and with empathy. Because you're framing this notion of, we're a minority, we're navigating the world, and then the last part of the curriculum is pride. What is Jewish pride? Why are we proud? How do we live our pride? How do we embody it? How do we have boundaries? How are we invested in social justice while still keeping a strong Jewish identity? So that's my curriculum that is currently sitting on my laptop that I've not done as much with as I should, but I think that we have to teach it. But that goes back to the question that you asked at the end about what are the things we agree on. We have to start agreeing. And I think, 3 Jews, 15 opinions is kind of cute, but actually I think it does stand in our way. There are certain things we should agree on. Israel is our homeland. And I have a bugbear when we describe Israel as our ancient home, or our historic home, because the whole point of indigeneity is not, it's our home today. You might be Americans, as I imagine you are, I'm British. So we have American, we have British, we might have other passports, and our home is also Israel. And that's why so many of us feel this pull, we want to go there, and when you go, your shoulders drop. But we have to give language to all of this. You will, hopefully, read this book, and there'll be a lot of this you know already. All of you. But what we're doing is framing it, or reframing it, and giving it specific language, because that's how we describe who we are. That's how we are able to understand it and tell the world, and we have to do that with our young people.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, for being here